When The Origin of Species was published in 1859, it was not well received. With few exceptions, Darwin's arguments for evolution only hardened scientists' positions. The prime weakness of Darwin's theory was his inability to explain how characteristics were transferred. When what Darwin called a wondrous monster would occur in a population, if the type were adaptable or fit, only his progeny should survive. Not so, Darwin's detractors argued. The process of natural selection is too slow. When this hairy type breeds with a bald, the results would be an in-between. And when the in-between type breeds within a greater population of bald, in a few generations, the hairy characteristics would be blended out. Ironically, the argument against blending out could have been destroyed had Darwin troubled himself to read Gregor Mendel. Interested in the hard facts of heredity, Mendel experimented with the common pea plant. One of the many characteristics the pea plant exhibits is two distinct seed shapes, round and wrinkled. Selecting a pure strain of each variety, round and wrinkled, he cross-pollinated the plants. Now, prevailing wisdom predicted that the results would be an in-between variety, except that the next generation yielded only round seeds. To test whether the wrinkled trait had vanished, he allowed the plants of the first hybrid generation to self-pollinate. Lo and behold, the wrinkled variety reappeared in the second hybrid generation. As often as he repeated the experiments, he always obtained a ratio of 3 round to 1 wrinkled. The genius of Mendel was simplicity itself. He assigned to the germ plasm of each pure variety 2 paired particles, which he called factors. The pure strain of the round variety contains 2 dominant factors, designated by uppercase R's. The recessive factors are contained in the wrinkled variety. These are designated with lowercase r's. In sexual reproduction, the pollen and egg contribute only one of the 2 factors. So when the one pure variety is fertilized with another pure variety, the only possible combination contains one of each factor, a dominant and a recessive. However, this first generation hybrid manifests only the dominant trait, namely roundness. Now, when these factors combine in reproduction to produce future offspring, each hybrid parent will contribute one of 2 possible factors. But because each hybrid parent has 2 different factors, there are now 4 ways these factors can combine. The combination of 2 dominant factors produces the dominant round form. The dominant factor from one parent may combine with the recessive factor from the other parent. In this case, the dominant factor, roundness, will prevail. Or the recessive factor from one parent may combine with the dominant factor from this parent, and again the dominant factor, roundness, is expressed. In only one case, when the recessive factor from one parent combines with the recessive factor from the other parent, does the wrinkled form prevail. Hence the famous Mendelian ratio, 3 to 1, 3 times as many round peas as wrinkled. So, Mendel could have provided Darwin with the ammunition he needed. Units of heredity are not blended, but rather preserved. Today, Mendel's term, factor, has been replaced with the term gene, the unit of heredity. And the constituent parts of the gene are called alleles. He enabled us to draw a distinction between the phenotype, the appearance of the organism, resulting from the genotype, the genetic makeup of an organism. Even 30 years after Mendel published his work, many scientists persisted in believing that in large breeding populations, the dominant gene would eventually eliminate the recessive gene. If the polka dot gene were dominant, would it eventually take over the bald recessive type? Surprisingly, the answer is no, if we are able to seal off the population from exterior influences. In 1908, G.H. Hardy scribbled on a napkin this mathematical expression. It demonstrated that the ratio of dominant to recessive would remain constant. If it looks familiar, it's the binomial theorem, which you probably thought wasn't very useful. Let's visualize the way alleles from hybrid parents combine in reproduction. Let P represent the frequency of the dominant allele, and Q represent the frequency of the recessive allele. Simple substitution. P in the place of uppercase R, Q in the place of lowercase r. A little multiplication, a little mop-up, and a little more. Now we'll put the equation together. And quickly clean it up. Our population is 100%, so we can substitute the number 1. Oh, so elegant, but perhaps you're not yet convinced. Imagine a gene pool. In it, the dominant allele is carried by 80% of the male gametes, and the recessive allele by 20%. Likewise, the dominant allele is carried by 80% of the female gametes, and the recessive by 20%. The chance of a dominant coupling is determined by multiplying 80% by 80%, rendering 64%. A recessive coupling involves the same mathematical exercise to produce 4%. This is, of course, exactly what is expressed by the theorem where P equals 80% and Q equals 20%. We'll tidy up the math and return to graphic form. No matter how much a population expands, this ratio will remain constant as long as the population isn't disturbed. The Hardy-Weinberg law is a theoretical model that illustrates how genes are distributed and preserved. The gene frequencies for a population come to equilibrium under strict conditions. The population must be exceedingly large, and the creatures permitted to breed randomly. In other words, no sexual selection occurs. But if one phenotype can never replace another, doesn't the model contradict Darwin? To the contrary, the Hardy-Weinberg model acts as a barometer to indicate something is happening to the population. If the hairies flourish, as the baldies expire, perhaps Darwin's natural selection is at work. But the big question remains: how does a wondrous monster pop out of the population in the first place?